it just remains for me to invite you all to stay after the lecture, join us for a drink and some snacks in the next room. We can speak to the speaker a little more, and you can chat to me if you're interested about any aspect of the program. But as those of you who've been here before know, these lectures in this spring series are hosted, curated, masterminded by the first-year students. So with that, I would like to invite to the podium one of our first-year students, Linda Decker.
I'm Linda Decker, first-year student. Much of our work here at Decrit explores questions of beauty, significance, utility, and our emotional connections to objects. As consumers, we make decisions based on style and appearance, and we imbue our possessions with meaning. For me, it is my shoe collection. I have a lot of beautiful high heels, which I never wear, but you can see that I use them as photo props. Although they are impractical in a walking city such as New York, I get tremendous pleasure just knowing they are on a shelf, possessing the potential to transform my rather ordinary life into something far more glamorous. Our guest this evening has written extensively about glamour and design and their role at the intersection of culture and commerce. In her book, The Substance of Style, she wrote, "The 21st century has become the age of aesthetics, and whether we realize it or not, this influence has taken over the marketplace and much more." Virginia Postrel is one of my favorite authors, as you can see with all my Post-its, and her work has been called intellectual arbitrage because of her ability to synthesize and communicate ideas from fashion to economics in an original and accessible way. She is currently a regular columnist for Bloomberg View, and her new book, The Power of Glamour, is being published this fall. Please join me in welcoming Virginia Postrel.
Thank you, Linda. I love the Post-it notes. My husband, because I do that too, my husband calls it fungus. He says, "Oh, this book has a lot of fungus in it." So I'm waiting here for Victor to do this little switch over between PowerPoint and Keynote. Okay. So I don't have a degree in design criticism. I don't have a degree in much of anything. I have a degree in English literature. And when people ask me, what do you do? Some people think I'm an economist, which is definitely not true. I'm married to an economist. I know that's not. But they ask me, what do I do? And I say, I'm a writer. And then they ask me, what do you write? Which in LA means, oops. Well, I don't do a very good job with PowerPoint, which in LA means, are you a screenwriter? Are you really a writer, or are you one of those people? You know? And I say, no, I write nonfiction. And then the question is, well, what do you write about? My most recent articles for Bloomberg were on self-driving cars and movie stars. And of course, I wrote these two books, and I have another one coming out. And the first book, most people think of as politics, although that's only part of it. And the second book people think of as design, although that's only part of it. And they don't know what to do with this one. This is not the cover, but the cover, because the cover isn't out yet, but I think it's going to kind of look like that. It's going to have that picture. So as Linda said, I think of myself as somebody who writes about commerce and culture. That's sort of how I define myself. And I think of commerce and culture as not what some people consider sort of hostile worlds, which is a term that the sociologist Viviana Zelizer coined to term what she disagreed with, the hostile worlds thesis. Commerce and culture, at least as we live them, are not hostile. They're complementary. They're intertangled in many complicated ways, and they're both sort of complex, emergent phenomena. Nobody is in charge of them. They just, you know, somehow through all the decisions and the desires and the creativity and the contradictions that we all have in our lives, what the commercial world looks like at any given time, what the marketplace looks like at any given time, and what the culture looks like at any given time emerge, and they're constantly changing. And I find that very interesting. So in my work, there are kind of two big questions. And I want, since you're sort of, many of you are in the program and are thinking about being writer, I want to sort of, I decided to organize this very big topic by talking about the evolution of my thought through the different books I've written and how I hit on and addressed and learned from and changed my mind about questions of the relationship between value and economic value and meaning. And the first big question that motivates much of my work is the question, where does economic growth come from? This is the question of the wealth of nations. Why, that's the collective word, but why are we so much richer than people in 1880? And this would look much more dramatic if you took it back to 1680. I mean, there's been this enormous takeoff, and yes, the economy's bad now compared to 10 years ago maybe, but over time, there's this tremendous growth. Now, I am not an economic historian, and I don't address the big question. I address smaller questions that bear on the big question. So wealth doesn't rain from the sky, and it doesn't, contrary to what people used to believe, in centuries past, it isn't really something you can dig up out of the ground. And in fact, I mean, this is a mural in a state building in California. The people who really struck it rich in the gold rush were the guys who made the blue jeans. I mean, that was Levi's. They're still around. These prospectors, some of them got temporarily rich. A lot of them suffered and didn't get much. So value comes from strange places. And that's really the question we need to ask. It's not this sort of macroeconomic, where does growth come from? I mean, that's an interesting question, but let's ask them deeper, or what comes first, which is, where does new economic value come from? How do you get from this to this? What changes in the world, and how does that happen? Now, one answer, traditional answer to where does economic value come from? Is, well, of course, it comes from inputs. It comes from materials and labor. And, that's what Adam Smith believed. That's what Karl Marx believed. I mean, that was kind of what your taxi cab driver is, what the man in the street believes. And where does the economic value come from? It comes from materials and labor. But that's not really what we mean by value, because what about the creativity of the entrepreneur? What about something, people doing new things that maybe aren't even about the material? And this is the other story that you'll hear. It's all about the heroic inventor, the heroic entrepreneur. It's genius, it's inspiration, it's perspiration. But of course, even brilliant inventors have bad ideas. And then there's the question of, well, what do we mean by a bad idea? I mean, a bad idea might be a bad idea that actually hurts people, but a bad idea might just be something like, there are apparently no pictures of the concrete piano, but these are the concrete stereo cabinets. It may just be something that people don't want. And so it's actually the economic value of it, that is the value that people who might use it place on it, is less than the value of the materials and labor that went into it. So my first book, with kind of this as the background, is, in this context, is about another theory. It's about trial and error progress. You try the concrete piano, people don't like it, so maybe you go on to the phonograph. I don't know that was the order, but it's about trial and error progress, learning over time. And it highlights a different theory of innovation. And this is not about meaning, this is about function. And this is, I think, a really brilliant idea from a guy named Henry Petrosky, who's a civil engineer who wrote, among other things, this book. And in my book, I talk a lot about contact lenses, which I won't now, but about their evolution over time. At the time I wrote the book, I still wore contact lenses. Now I got LASIK, see, progress. And Henry Petrosky makes the point that when you have a newly designed artifact, even if it does exactly what the designer intended, as soon as you have that thing in use, you start to see how it could be better. Maybe not how to, you start to see the problems it has, why it's not perfect. And that then leads to improvements over time. And this is also the idea behind the rage for rapid prototyping today, which is sort of put some of that before you actually go to market. This is the idea of form follows failure, and Henry Petrosky says, the future perfect can only be a tense, not a thing, which is a phrase I think is really great. So I wrote The Future and Its Enemies, and I was thinking about new sources of economic value. And like many people who are kind of nerdy, I thought of it in terms of function. I thought about economic value in terms of function, making things work better, which is definitely a source. But there's more to it than that. And so going back to the idea, this, by the way, is the one that I really want to buy this print, and I keep not doing it. Anyway, value is subjective. Value is in the eye of the beholder. When I say value, I mean what you're willing to pay for something in the marketplace. It's not about inputs, it's about the exchange. Now, economists have a very technical way of talking about this, which I will give you the standing on one foot version. Value equals what they call willingness to pay, which is sort of like how much would you be willing to pay for this water bottle if it were the only water bottle in the entire world? It's like a monopoly concept. It's very technical, and there's like ways of doing it. But just think of it in terms of value is what you, the user, value, not how much did it cost to make. Your value could be less than it cost to make, it could be more than it cost to make, it could be exactly what it cost to make, but it's in your head. And then there's something that economists call surplus. And surplus is value minus those costs, the cost to make it. And then the question is, who gets the surplus? How does it get divided up between the seller and the buyer? I mean, we happen to live in a period where there are lots and lots of things that people put very high values on. If it were the only, how much do you value Google? But you don't have to pay anything for them. So you're getting a tremendous amount of the surplus, and it makes it very hard to do economic calculations. But other times, if there's a monopoly and they can really hold you up, they get all the surplus. And my husband teaches strategy, and a lot of what they teach these MBAs is to think about, how can you as the company capture more of that surplus. This is our little economics lesson for today. We will get back on to more fun stuff. Imagination and desire. That's how you should think about the intersection of commerce and culture. That they're both about imagination and desire, or creativity and desire is what I used to say until I started working on glamour, and the glamour is imagination is a more glamorous word. So the second big question after where does new economic value come from that I'm interested in is, why do people buy things? And by things, I don't mean just objects, but experiences. Why do they buy things? And particularly, why do they buy things they quote unquote don't need? Now, we can fight all day about whether you need something or not, and what is a need. Do you need caffeine? Do you need to buy Marilyn Monroe's dress for $5.6 million? But I think it's fair to say that when we have these whole amazing, the most glamorous store in America is not Bergdorf's, it is the Container Store. That is the store that will change your life. When we have an entire store devoted to boxes, I was once driving a French intellectual who shall remain nameless around Dallas, and he was very taken by the department store of boxes. And when we have that, it's pretty safe to say people are buying things they don't, in some sense, need. Why do they do that silly thing? And this is not a new phenomenon. You can buy these coats now this coat has 19 different pockets in it for all your gadgets. And you might think this is new, but Adam Smith wrote about this phenomenon in the 18th century. How many people ruin themselves by laying out money on trinkets of frivolous utilities, aka gadgets? What pleases these lovers of toys is not so much the utility as the aptness of the machines which are fitted to promote it. All their pockets are stuffed with little conveniences. They contrive new pockets, unknown in the clothes of other people, in order to carry a greater number. And, he really making that point that the thing that is delighting people, that's leading them to buy those things, is not their utility. Although these wild-fangled things were things like fingernail clippers. It was the ingenuity of them. There was something about the design of them that was fascinating to people. So why buy things you don't need? If you ask economists, or you ask social critics, or you ask a lot of the general public, the first explanation that comes to mind is Thorstein Veblen's explanation. People buy things they don't need because they want status. It's conspicuous consumption. And also in this explanation, because it dates back to the turn of the 20th century and is formed very much by images of very, very rich people, it equates status with money. I mean, there are other forms of status, but in the most popular, it's conspicuous consumption. You spend a lot of money, people know you're wealthy, they're impressed, you feel good, that's one story. And this is not false. I mean, this clearly goes on in the world. It's just not the only thing that goes on. And I think it's by far, at least in our period, not the most interesting thing that goes on. The other explanation of why people buy things they don't need is they're tricked. They're hypnotized. They're fooled. And I teach in the branding program upstairs rather, and I saw these books left over from one of the classes on the shelf last year. And these are all books that are sort of, in one way or the other, based on the idea that selling people things they don't need is all about trickery. And a lot of our historical intellectual culture around understanding consumer culture is based on the notion that people are somehow fooled or foolish or manipulated and sort of acting against their interest. And one of my favorite examples is actually in the Substance of Style, is Vance Packard, who wrote this very big, influential 1957 book called The Hidden Persuaders about the evils of advertising. He was very against waste. And one of the things he used as an example of waste was having telephones in different colors. It was really terrible that you could now get a pink telephone because people were replacing their old black phones, which were perfectly good, with these fancy pink phones. And one wonders what he would think today. So first I read the Future and Its Enemies, and I thought about innovation and creation of economic value in terms of function, which is not really that different from the way Vance Packard thought about it. Then I started to notice that things were that there was this incredible aesthetic competition going on, and things were getting prettier and more interesting, and there was a lot of emphasis around design that was not really about the functional aspects of design, but about other aspects of design. Designers all say, you say, what do designers do? They always say designers solve problems, as if that's unique to designers. Janitors solve problems too, and accountants solve problems, and writers solve problems. I'm sure you're solving problems. That's why they pay you to do it. That's why they call it work, because it's solving problems. The question is, what kinds of problems do designers solve? And when I started working on the Substance of Style, because I, being this kind of not terribly visually oriented nerd person, started to notice that the world was getting much more interesting looking, and things that were not traditionally aesthetic objects were having this sort of aesthetic content. So the Substance of Style is not about fashion or it's not about great architecture. It's about Starbucks. It's about the fact that Starbucks, when they opened, it was this cutting edge idea to have this place that had this blonde furniture and these nice lamps and stuff, that just was a mass market place. And then now it's like, well, Starbucks is boring, but it's sort of like, if you can't look as good as Starbucks, you really shouldn't even think about opening someplace. So they're seeing this change. So okay, this is an example of people buying things they don't need. Why is that? What's going on? So going to the question of what are the problems that designers solve? Well, designers do a lot of solving of functional problems. But what I was noticing was they're solving this problem of these other problems, which are the problems of pleasure and meaning. How do you imbue designed objects or spaces with pleasure and meaning for people? Now, and why is it that people suddenly seem to consumers put more value on those? So to answer that question about why do consumers put more value on pleasure and meaning, usually what people will show you is they will show you Maslow's pyramid. Now, there is nothing wrong with Maslow's pyramid as Maslow actually wrote it. This picture is not in Maslow. You have to have physiological needs. Obviously, if you're starving to death, that's going to be foremost in your mind. You need to feel safe. If you have barely enough food to survive and you're running from the Civil War, you're not going to be, doing as much self-actualization. But the truth is that this gets misplayed, and we fool ourselves because we grew up in this sort of mass market, mass production society, and we forget that very poor people invented most of the beauty in the world. I mean, originally, versions of it. And the truth is that people care about the look and feel of the world around them. It's a human fact. And there were particular conditions that had to do with the relative costs of goods and services and places and people's levels of wealth that led to a period where progress represented getting everybody to what I call not bad. But that's a story mostly about pleasure. What about meaning? So first, forget Maslow. I mean, don't forget Maslow, but forget the pyramid. So in the Substance of Style, I thought about meaning, and I thought, meaning is really about identity and how you signal who you are. Whether you are an individual, like a person, who am I, Virginia, or whether you are, say, a magazine. And that signal has two components. There's the standing out, I am an individual, and there's the fitting in, I am an individual who belongs to this group. So if you're designing a cover for a magazine, you need to know, for example, is this cover a fashion magazine or is it a sports magazine? And interestingly, if it's a fashion magazine, you use serifs, and if it is a sports magazine, you will not. I noticed that when I did the Google search. Aside from, of course, the pictures will be different, the color palette, all these things. So there's this sense of signaling identity by standing out and fitting in, and you get pretty good signals from it when you deal with other people. Which are the Swedish designers here? And you can tell they're designers because they all wear black and the color and the black is in black. But you can tell they're Swedish because of their hair. Because there might be some other sort of Northern Europe, but this kind of hair where it's like done that way, very characteristic. And these other guys, they are what? Engineering professors. Are you surprised? You get these things, it's called costume echoes, where you sort of, it's not you call your best friend up on the phone and say, what are you going to wear today? I want to wear the same thing. It's that you have an identity that is partly constructed by who you identify with, and you echo those people one way or another. However, those signals depend on context. So, which of these is the church and which is the government building? Any American can tell you the easy answer to that question. But when I was walking down the street in London one day, I said, what is that giant church? It's not a giant church, it's a courthouse. Giant churches look like this. Context matters. That is also why you see the retro vintage wearing gals with their big puffy 50s skirts and tattoos. That wouldn't have gone over in the 50s, but different peer group. So in the Substance of Style, I had this idea that meaning and the value that the economic value people derive from meaning and conveyed through aesthetics is about identity, and identity is about standing out and fitting in. It's about signaling. So it's not signaling status like Thorstein Veblen would say. It's not about creating a look how rich I am, but it is about something about here's who I am. And like Thorstein Veblen, that is not wrong, but it is also not the whole story. So then I got sucked into the world of glamour. Somebody asked me to write about glamour, and I said yes, even though I didn't know anything about glamour. And over the last quite a few years, I've thought a lot about what is glamour as a psychological process in a form of nonverbal rhetoric, something that works like humor, where it creates a specific emotional response between an audience and an object. I'm not going to give a talk about glamour today. I'm going to talk about some things I learned about meaning and economic value by thinking about glamour. And it starts with the idea of inarticulate longings. There was a woman named Lois Artery who was an advertising executive in 1924. She worked for J. Walter Thompson, and she coined this term to sort of to describe to their clients what they were trying to tap as advertisers. She told the story of a woman who went to the store to buy a practical blue gingham dress. Now, this particular blue gingham dress happens to be a famous costume from the movie Mildred Pierce starring Joan Crawford, which was auctioned off in the same auction with the Marilyn Monroe dress, which is how I got the picture. But in the 20s, 30s, and in the early 20th century, a blue gingham dress was like the most practical thing you could imagine. I mean, I don't even think we have something quite that practical today, because even like blue jeans and a t-shirt, I guess the closest thing would be like the guy buying the khakis, the guy who has no fashion sense, who goes to buy the khakis because he's got the dress down casual, business casual outfit. It's a totally practical dress. Dorothy wore one in The Wizard of Oz, as you may recall. It's a totally practical dress. Everybody had one, not terribly expensive, very not glamorous. So the woman goes to the store to buy the blue gingham dress, but she sees the pink negligee. And she goes home with the pink negligee. And why is that? So Lois Artery wrote about this idea of inarticulate longings. The woman, our known want and recognized need is for a blue gingham dress, but the sight of a pink negligee somehow sets aflame a desire which until this unrestrained moment we have not known existed. Dormant desires unknown even to ourselves, but how full of possibilities. So there's something going on here that is creating this sort of sense of desire and possibility and longing. Or it's not really creating it. What it is it's channeling it. There's a pre-existing desire, and that desire has something to do with identity that has nothing to do with standing out and fitting in the, I dress like my friends way. She wants to think of herself not as a practical, thrifty housewife, which she is, but as a super feminine seductress. She wants to have this other aspect of herself fulfilled. And when she sees this particular object, in this case, the pink negligee, it channels that longing. It has meaning about her identity. And this sort of longing, and this goes into the ideas of glamour, is about dreams of escape and transformation in particular. Now, there are other forms of inarticulate longing, but this is where glamour comes in. Glamour always says you can, whatever this glamorous object is, it offers a sort of a promise of escape and transformation where you get in touch with the you want to be, with your ideal life, with your ideals. And this is why we so often see glamour around things you can wear, places you can go. They have a kind of resonance and meaning that is greater than whatever the object or the good is itself, because they have this, they put you in touch with your ideals. Now, Grant here is probably saying, wait a minute, I wrote about that. So here's my Venn diagram. I grew up with the new math. So we're going to have Venn diagram in my book on glamour. Now, there are two very smart social scientists whose work I drew on in the book on glamour, and who both have a lot to say about meaning as a source of economic value. In fact, you could leave out the pink, the glamour stuff, and just look at their overlap. There's a sociologist named Colin Campbell who writes about the question, why is modern consumerism so insatiable? Why is it that we're never satisfied? And he posits that in the modern world, and he has a whole theory of religion and romanticism, which I won't get into, and I'm not sure it's right, but he posits that in the modern world, we have a new form of hedonism. Used to be that hedonism was all about things that you had done, but imagining how fun it would be to do things you had done in the past that were specifically sensory. So I like to eat chocolate. I imagine, oh, I would love to eat chocolate. You know, hedonism is about eating more chocolate. I like to have sex. Hedonism is about having more sex. You know, hedonism was about eat, drink, and be merry. It was about these sorts of pleasures. He said there's a new form of hedonism that arrives with modernity, defined not in the 21st century streamlined chains way, but in the early modern Europe Renaissance way. You could say with commercial culture in some sense. There's this new form of hedonism which is about things you haven't experienced, and you enjoy imagining what it would be like to experience them. You become an architect of your imagination. And so, for example, you might imagine your dream house, or you might imagine going to a new restaurant. And then he says, but the problem is you go to the new restaurant, you have this new experience, you go to that beach that you always wanted to escape, and it never is quite as good as you pictured in your head. And so, therefore, you're on to the next imagination. But the experience of the imagining is also pleasurable. So that's his idea. Grant McCracken, who's a cultural anthropologist, whose work I highly recommend, has the idea of displaced meaning. Displaced meaning is a cultural concept. The idea is every culture has ideals that for one or another practical reasons they can never realize right here in the here and now. And so but those ideals are very important to providing the culture with meaning. So they displace those ideas into some other realm. So it could be a golden age, you know, back once upon a time, things were better. It could be the coming of the Messiah, or it could be, I have this in, Grant doesn't use it, after the singularity, we will all be uploaded and live happily ever after, all our ideas. And there's a whole range of these. And these are very important to cultures, that they have these ideas where all of their precious ideals, they can tell stories about them, they can have myths about them that connect people with what is most precious and valued in that culture. So that has nothing to do with commerce specifically. I mean, it could be about religion, it could be about politics. But he says, especially for individuals, there are also forms of displaced meaning that do become wrapped up in consumer goods. So, for example, you have an ideal of the perfect family life, the perfect domestic life, which is tied up in your idea of the perfect house, your dream house. And then he says, and sometimes consumer goods can be bridges to those dreams. So you can't have your dream house, but you can have your perfect refrigerator, that sort of thing. And that this also helps to explain why people invest so much meaning in things that would otherwise seem to be functional. And then I have this whole concept of like, in glamour, it's this intersection, which we won't go into all the particulars. But the point is that there's some very interesting social science work about why it is that we attach economic value to meanings of goods that have to do with the way they play with our imaginations and our desires and our ideals. So as I was working on here's another ad, as I was working on The Power of Glamour, I became aware of these two contradictory things about the way we think about meaning and economic value. One is how much really interesting work there is on the subject in social science, in history. There are a lot of feminist critics who have written some really interesting things about women in commercial culture, just all over the map, but it's not in one place. And the second thing I became aware of was how little people know about it, because they are still relying basically on the idea that either it's conspicuous consumption or it's a fetish. Now, there's actually rich work thinking about fetishes, but for most people it's just like, it's bad. It's something, it's false, it's deceptive. So, you could ask economists, but the problem with economists, I didn't do that right, is they say, we don't know, and they say, we don't care. We don't know why people buy things that they don't need, and we don't care. We just take tastes as given. And that's a perfectly fine thing to do if you want to answer the questions that economists want to answer. But it is not a good way to understand sort of how people live in commercial culture. So I've gotten interested in trying to sort of read and popularize and think about all of this scattered research, which takes the view that meaning and value in commercial culture are complex and they're emergent, and even when we think that we know what's going on, we often don't. Now, this has a lot of jargon in it, but I think it says something. This is from a paper about the American Girl dolls. And so they say, powerful, emotionally resonant brands tend to be complex, the product of multiple creators authoring multiple representations in multiple venues. Because they found that what the dolls meant to the girls and to the mothers and to the grandmothers was related to, but not exactly the same as what the company said. There was this whole complicated creation of meaning. The complexity of these brands is the source of their power, but it also renders them difficult to characterize completely and definitively. They do not reside in any of their constituent parts. Rather, they are products of the dynamic interaction between these parts and the system or gestalt they comprise. So this sort of meaning, which is, in this case, produces a really valuable brand that people spend a lot of money on, the meaning sort of emerges partly from what the designers, if you want to use that term, put out there, but also from the experiences and the interpretations that the customers bring to it. Another interesting study a couple of studies, but by the same people that I read, were about, I mentioned Starbucks lately. Well, Starbucks sort of spawned anti-Starbucks. So having an anti-Starbucks is also something that you can do in the marketplace, and people, have had a lot of success with that, offering an alternative. And so what is the meaning of that? And why do people go to these sort of anti-Starbucks coffee houses? Well, there were a couple of anthropologists / marketing professors called Zeynep Arfel and Craig Thompson who investigated this. And they found that there were two distinct groups that went to these anti-Starbucks, whom they called café flaneurs and oppositional localists. I almost made a slip, which could be characterized as cosmopolitan or radical. The cosmopolitan, which is their term, are the people who think Starbucks is all right. They're not like evil or anything, but they're really boring and corporate, and the food isn't as good, and the service isn't as personal, and I just prefer this other environment. And that's basically an aesthetic preference, but it's not just about pleasure, it's also about who these people perceive themselves to be. They're more worldly, they want to be people of taste, they are people who value variety and diversity as opposed to predictability and order. There's a lot of identity tied up to that. So that's these people, symbolized by the red cup with the pretty flower. Then there's the other kind of red cup from Red Emma's in Baltimore, which are, they go to the anti-Starbucks. It's a political statement. They don't like Starbucks, and they think Starbucks is evil. They're not, these first people think Starbucks is maybe boring. The second group thinks Starbucks is evil. They don't like them because they're corporate, and they don't think of corporate as boring, although they may, but it's not primarily boring. It's mostly part of a bad system. And so they want to patronize a different kind of coffee house for a different reason. And these are very different groups. And they are, although the second group in particular would not like to admit it, people who are attaching economic value to the particular meanings that goes, and that economic value, what they're willing to pay, goes far beyond just the cost of the coffee. It says something about who they are. So the moral of the story is that meaning and value and the relationship between the two is very complex. And this is a complex necklace. This is Mark Newsom designed this. It's called the Julia necklace. It's designed around fractals. And that should about do it. Thank you. And we're going to have questions after.
We will both be interviewing. This is Linda Decker, first year student, who will be kicking off the Q&A. Virginia, I'll be throwing in a lot of questions here and there, and then we'll open up the floor.
Well, thanks so much, Virginia. It was a great talk. Here at DCRIT, we're always trying to learn how to research and identify subjects. Could you speak a little bit about how you identify your subjects?
You mean how I identify them originally? Yeah. That's very hard because it's different depending on the specific thing. I mean, there are subjects for articles and there are subjects for books, first of all. So, for example, so I wrote two recent articles. I wrote one on self-driving cars. And the way I identified that was I went to Silicon Valley and I was doing sort of informational interviews and talking to people. And for reasons that were partly just coincidence, I ended up having a lot of conversations about cars in Silicon Valley. There's a news center at Stanford that's devoted to the interdisciplinary study of the automobile, not just self-driving, but in general. And it's not just there had been previously a sort of technical center for studying automotive innovation, but this is more cultural. You know, they sponsor history courses and sociology courses, and you know, it's not. And so I talked to the guy there anyway. So that led to, and it related to some of my longstanding interests in where innovation comes from and why Silicon Valley continues to be a productive place for innovation. So I got that idea that way. I wrote the piece about Denzel Washington and movie stars. I was inspired by two things. One was there was a Harris poll. Harris poll does, every year they ask Americans who their favorite movie stars were, and Denzel Washington has been in the top 10 like nearly every year for a long time since they started it, but he was number one. And that particularly interested me because in some of the reading I did on the early days of Hollywood, there was a 1939 book called Hollywood at the Movies where, you know, experts said Americans would, you know, the movie-going public would never want their escape personality to be black. And I liked the idea of writing a column that was mostly about the idea of an escape personality and generally like what's the difference between a movie aesthetic elements of design as being the sort of frontier of innovation, and wondered why that happened. So a lot of it comes from asking questions. Well, why is that? You know, what's going on there? And then reading widely, and you know, I read social science, I read history, you know, I get interested in things and just, you know, read up on them. And then once I'm engaged in a subject, particularly in a book, I follow footnotes. So I see, oh, this person whose work I liked cited this other person, and maybe it's not relevant, but maybe I should go find that and read it and see if it is relevant.
Yeah, we've been talking about that as the students are starting to think about working on their thesis project, the idea of footnotes and signposts.
Yeah, yeah.
Through the research field. I actually have a question. Can I throw in about that, the moving, oh, I think so.
Yeah, okay.
I hear you. Moving across all of those different disciplines in your research, and Linda said it was described in the introduction as kind of intellectual arbitrage.
Yeah, that's actually the Postrel family description. My husband and I actually have an LLC called Intellectual Arbitrage LLC. Sam Tannenhouse, who's now at the Times, described it as being like a DJ also.
Which I can certainly see the benefits of. I mean, it sounds like it's really enriching, but I imagine there may be challenges too in kind of moving across the disciplines at that level.
Yeah, there are a couple of challenges. First of all, I have a really good grounding in economics. I'm not an economist, but you know, I'm married to an economics PhD. I spent 6 years writing every 4 weeks an economics column for the New York Times. I know, you know, at least a dozen Nobel laureates in economics. I mean, you know, I know a lot of economists, and I can talk to them and I can translate their work for the public. So I'm very confident in my ability to write about economics in the areas that I'm interested in, which do not include the areas these days everyone wants to write about, which are macro, where nobody knows anything, and finance, which I just was never interested in. But so that helps. I mean, so I have a really good grounding there. And I think over time I've developed good taste, so I can tell sort of by the way people write and engage with each other. But there are risks because you can, you know, you can definitely step into things that people say, well, you know, if you only knew so-and-so. Now, I do that to some degree deliberately because I don't agree with some of the I ignore things that I think are nonsense sometimes. You know, you will not see Freudian explanations in my work, and I will not bother saying, you know, taking precious pages about why they're wrong. I'm not going to address creation science either. You know, you can all come and all you Freudians can come and attack me, but there are definitely cases, and over time I have gotten more confident about moving into new areas, but I never would have done the things I do now when I was 30. When I was 30, I stuck to things where, you know, it was a much less adventurous scope of things.
No, I think it's really interesting, and it's probably a model that a lot of the emerging writers here really admire and would want high-level, moving above and across disciplines, and then doing a zoom in.
Right. And the other thing that's really important, and this is, when I wrote that New York Times economics column, there were 4 columnists, and I did the column differently from the other 3, 2 of whom were professional economists. I would read a paper, and then I would get the author or authors to talk to me on the telephone about it. And in many cases, asking them questions that I knew, or at least thought I knew the answers to, just to check my understanding. It also made more interesting column because you could have quotes, and often you would learn things about, interesting results they got that because of the genre conventions of academic papers wouldn't get in the paper. What actually motivated the research, the question that engaged them wouldn't be in the paper. You have to talk to them. So when you actually do a lot of interviews, that helps too. And over time, that can help with specific things, but it can also put you in touch with people who are good to bounce ideas off of more generally.
I'd just sort of like to jump over a little bit into design and a touch on glamour for a moment. Last week I was speaking to a fashion designer, Yoli, and she said to me that she thought fashion criticism was so often lifestyle oriented and really sort of compartmentalized as sort of like an anthropological type of discipline, much more so than really having sort of as a serious design discipline. Like architecture is a serious design discipline.
What? I don't, you mean, okay, so yeah, it's.
So, and then lack of critical discourse keeps fashion from being included in museums such as MoMA, as opposed to being included in, say, a costume collection at the Met.
Okay, well, I've actually written about fashion in museums. I did a piece for The Atlantic about fashion in museums that at the time I was very dissatisfied with, but I reread it recently. It's actually pretty good. but there's a question of why you put fashion in a museum, and different museums have different criteria. So if you, to take one extreme, why would you put fashion in the Smithsonian? It would be as fashion as history, which is actually the part of fashion that I'm the most interested in, which is not about fashion as glamour. It's fashion as cultural artifacts. Why is fashion in the Metropolitan Museum? Now, it's called the Costume Institute, but if you look at their collection, they aspire, and especially at the things that they're the proudest of, like the Alexander McQueen show, it's fashion that aspires to be high art, fashion that is visually resonant. Now, I have somewhat, I don't know. I believe that good art creates a reaction to it moves you with its visual elements before you know its story. So if you have to have a long caption about the message of this piece, something is wrong. You can still have the message of the piece, but there should be more to it. And so I think one thing I like about when they do the fashion right is it works on both levels. Fashion at FIT and their museum is about pieces that move fashion forward. So it's about the story of fashion, and that's an aesthetic story. And I would argue that FIT's collection is about design. But, a lot of the design discourse that people develop is off. It moves away from the design solves problems, and it moves away from design is about meaning. It becomes what? I don't know. I'm not sure. There is fashion theory. People write all kinds of articles about fashion with lots of French theory and big jargony words. I don't know that makes fashion more respected. But the fashion writing and scholarship that really wows me tends to be historical, actually. I mean, it's I was at a conference where a woman was talking about the fashion archaeology. I mean, digging up garments from the hill town in Italy and being able to identify the fact that this same dress had been worn and remade over a period of 200 years by identifying the stitching. Now that is, there's a design story there, but I'm not sure it's not what she was looking for,
Well, just to stay on fashion for a minute, you showed several magazines in your presentations. There's a fashion magazine versus a sports magazine. And one of the evolutions in the fashion magazine over maybe the last 15, 20 years has been fashion models are no longer featured on covers.
Right. It's celebrities, yeah.
What's happened?
Well, okay, so fashion models are no longer featured on models and on covers, and people attribute that to celebrity culture, and that's somewhat true. I think it's about the reader wanting to identify with the person on the cover, and I think that started at a time in the early 90s where fashion models were and fashion photography and the look and feel of fashion were largely repulsive to a lot of people, and that opened the door for people to look at movie stars instead, because and they're also farther from a movie star is distant from you, but a movie star is not a coat hanger. A movie star has to move in space and has some kind of physicality to them that fashion has been moving away from in recent years. These things in fashion, I think, they're cyclical, and there will be but in the quote unquote supermodel era, it wasn't just that the editors had different attitudes. It was that the women looked different. They looked more aspirational than somebody who looks like one step out of Auschwitz. It's hollow eyes and put enough makeup on it, they look okay. But I think they've been. I am not one who thinks, it's terrible that fashion models are thinner than the average woman. I think that's perfectly fine, and that's always been the case. And I've spent a lot of time looking at drawings in 1920s and 30s fashion magazines, and believe me, nobody ever looked like that. Not even genetic freaks. But I think that one reason that the move toward having celebrities on the cover has been successful and continues to be successful is that the fashion models are not people who inspire longing in the audience. And then the fact that the celebrities are also familiar faces helps too, because people they feel like they know them. And that has something to do with also, American fashion magazine in particular they have this kind of ingratiating type cover most of the time, which is, okay. But.
We've got questions. Students first, and then any students want to ask?
Somebody in the back? Oh, we can't see.
No, all right. That's okay.
Virginia, I love your work for many reasons. One of which
Just because I quote you.
No, but one of the reasons I especially like it is that it feels to me, as a reader, that there's something kind of irreducible about your curiosity. You're sitting down thinking about a topic, you're working through the possibilities, and you're not satisfied until you're satisfied, until you come up. And so when somebody says, there's a Derridean answer to this, or Lacan has a good way of thinking, you're not interested in those. You're not interested in...
I might read them, but if I think they're nonsense, I won't.
But you're not interested in receiving wisdom. You're interested in your wisdom. And for young writers in the audience, I think that's a precious thing. Right? You just have that irreducible curiosity. You sit down and you just think it through. Where does that come from?
I think it comes from DNA, Grant. I am, and the thing that's about that also is that I don't start as a theorist. I start as an empiricist. I derive theory inductively by looking at lots of examples. I really am curious about sort of how how the world, I mean, I like to just learn stuff, even if it's not particularly useful for anything. That's why I go and I pop out this example and, put it into a story, because that is this thing I've been carrying around for a few years because I just thought it was cool and interesting and stuck in my head. So, yeah, I mean, that's just, it's that, and, and I benefit, there are many disadvantages to not being grounded in a discipline, but the other advantage is I don't have to conform to the conventions of a discipline, because it's often the case, I talked about how I would talk to the economists and I'd learn the interesting stories behind the papers, and the same thing happens with other sorts of, disciplines. There's certain conventions in any academic discipline, and, your new interesting work will be there, but it may be buried under some of these conventions. I mean, part of what I do is, try to find the good stuff and make it accessible to people who aren't within the field. And I appreciate why scholars have disciplinary conventions. Things can turn to complete mush without them. But as a writer, I benefit from not having to conform to them.
I was just wondering, a lot of the presentation, it's still kind of centered on the, the female role in fashion and consumption, in terms of, buying the silk dress instead of the functional one. And I feel like something that I've seen, the last 20 years, even longer, is that there is, kind of this male need for also that status or the little trinkets. And so I was just wondering, is the research still kind of keeping the gender separate? Just kind of what has been your experience?
Well, okay, this is a great question, because I didn't do this, but I've done another related speech where I talked about this. I think you're absolutely right. Everything I say, it applies to men too. You might change the examples, but it's definitely the case. And in fact, one of the things I pointed out, the Substance of Style, one of the few parts of that book where I actually did write about fashion, was I talked about the phenomenon of guys at an earlier age, partly because their mothers were working. There are a lot of different reasons. Were buying their own clothes rather than and therefore developing their own tastes and sort of their own visual identities, rather than just sort of wearing what mom said or whatever. It's more complicated than that, but so even in that area, you definitely see that. But all of this applies to guys. However, when you get to the scholarship on the subjects, one of the great things that feminist scholarship has done, particularly feminist scholarship coming out of Great Britain, has done is bring the consumer back into the story, the consumer, and also things like retailing, back into the story of economic development. The development of the department store in the 19th century was transformative. It was transformative like the railroad was transformative. It was huge, and it changed the way women lived. And it's mostly female, not entirely, because there was a guy who wrote a book about Bon Marché, but it's mostly female scholars who have brought that to bear, and they've mostly been interested in women's roles. But if we really want to understand the relationship between culture and consumption, we can't just study women, because guys buy things too, and they buy things for reasons that are, similar to but different from. They're overlapping reasons, but if people really studied it, I'm sure they would come up with some interesting things about the specifically, male roles in consumption. And the problem is the way the study of consumption has come back into social science and history has been mostly in these area fields like feminist scholars or queer studies. So we can find out how gay guys buy stuff, but not how heterosexual guys buy stuff, as if they don't ever buy anything. So it's like a really good thing that we're starting to study these things, but it's unfortunate that it's leaving out, the male side of the population. So I really appreciate your question.
You mentioned briefly that there are people who view consumerism as something deceptive or bad, or that advertising is manipulative. Right. Did you personally see an ethical component to either the advertising side of things or the consumer themselves?
Well, I mean, I don't buy into the traditional it's bad to want and buy things view, which is very much, I mean, although I was kind of raised that way, but not exactly. I was raised I think like many people in American culture, particularly in the sort of the mid to late 20th century, were raised with a lot of contradictions around that. But, I mean, the ethical components that I see in the marketplace are primarily the ethical components that you see in everyday life, that need to be honest and fair and, straightforward and all those sorts of things. In terms of this question about advertising bends minds, I heard a great paper on this recently by an anthropologist at Chicago, which is to say he agreed with me. And when I said this is all in my book, except he said it, in anthropological language. But he said, there tends to be this discussion where on the one side you have, it's all manipulation and false needs. And that's the one thing. And then the other people saying, no, that can't be true. Look at all the products that fail. Which is true. But then the first side can rightly say, but wait a minute, why do people spend all this money on marketing if it doesn't work? And what I would say, the best way of understanding what's going on, and which was also kind of what he was getting at, is that you have this sort of inchoate desire that then whatever form of marketing channels. And my book is about glamour, and that glamour is a very specific process and it has specific components, but it could be other things. And so that marketing doesn't create desires. Women did not start wanting to be beautiful when somebody invented makeup. I mean, that wasn't invented by Madison Avenue. That's an ancient desire. But the idea that, hope in a jar, that this particular thing might serve that purpose, that's where the marketing comes in. And, I think I guess I'm sort of Aristotelian. I mean, I think you have to have, balanced life. And I guess I am a little like the economist this way, in the sense that I don't spend a lot of time making judgments about other people's consumption practices. I can't move in my house because I have so many books, and that's something like a kind of insatiable consumption that you will never read an article about how bad it is. I have so many books, I could live to be 300 years old and never read all those books. And yet I buy more. Now I buy them on Kindle, though, because my house, otherwise I'm going to have to buy a new house. But, so this question of ethics and consumption, I think you have to unpack it vis-a-vis a specific question. Is such and such practice or such and such good? Does it raise ethical questions? I don't think you can just say consumption or commerce raises ethical questions. I think it's too vague, I guess.
I'm sort of interested in this sort of the hatred of glamour. I feel like I'm often surprised by people's intense dislike of anything glamorous. And I'm wondering if you can talk about whether, I think I probably have a skewed view on it, where it seems like when I see material from many, many decades ago, like I would say like 40s, 50s, or even earlier, and you see material from that time, and I think it's just material that gets surfaced, but it becomes this sort of beautiful nostalgia thing where everything seems like everyone's on board with glamour. And I feel like now there's a sort of shame in appreciating glamour, liking glamour.
Well, part of what I'm trying to do in the book is to remind people, or sort of develop the idea that you think you're not susceptible to glamour, but you really are. You just find different things glamorous. I think most people are susceptible to glamour. But to specifically talk about what you're raising, I think there are a bunch of different things going on. So first of all, glamour always contains an element of illusion. So in fact, the word glamour originally was a Scottish word that described, it was a name for a literal magic spell. You cast a glamour on someone, or you cast glamour on someone, and they saw something that wasn't there. And if you watch True Blood, they've kind of taken that original idea and turned it into a verb. And but so it meant a literal magic spell. And glamour, as it developed in English over the 19th century into the early 20th century, still it continues to contain that element of illusion. It's usually an illusion that the audience is aware of. In fact, I would say it's always an illusion that the audience is aware of. But when there's something illusory, if you're not really susceptible to it, you will be annoyed with other people who are. And B, you can be disillusioned. So, if you discover the thing that was glamorous is not, you actually get it, or you go to that place, or you vote for that candidate and they don't live up to all your hopes and dreams, you may be angry. So that's one thing. Then another reason is there is a difference between glamour as it operates today and glamour as it operated in 1935, which is that there was much more of sort of a common culture of glamour. And people were, this is actually, I argue in my book, people were sort of using glamour to figure out what it meant to be modern in a way that, was very different from people who were philosophers or artists writing manifestos about what it meant to be modern. But so we're going to be modern. What is the modern woman? What are modern conveniences? What is the modern life? And they would kind of go to the movies, and they would try, and they were kind of exploring this notion of modernism, modernity with glamour. And the people who were doing that were, very poor by today's standards, even the ones who were middle class in the day. And it was more consensus, whereas today we have a much more fragmented culture. And this is actually, I've written all my book, and the editor has signed off on it and everything, but I keep fiddling with the last chapter because I really don't want to have a long last chapter about today, but I keep coming back to this problem of it's hard to talk about what people find glamorous today because it's so many different things, because so many different audiences find things glamorous, including the idea of vintage glamour. The past is glamorous, and it's glamorous not just because it's the past, because that to a British housewife in 1950, make do and mend was something you just lived with, and you had. And what was glamorous was these dresses you couldn't possibly have. To a 30-year-old vintage blogger, make do and mend, which has now been turned into I can only reuse, recycle, and it is glamorous because it's different from what other people. The norm would be get a new thing at Zara, go to 20, Forever 21, and so there's this fragmentation, and then there are other people who grew up poor, and Jay-Z, what was glamorous to him was the idea of having an ice maker in your refrigerator. Different people see different things as glamorous, but that element of illusion makes everybody suspicious.
Is part of that problematic you're discovering in the contemporary age to do with irony, that glam seems so serious?
It's very, yes, there's another good point. Is the other thing about glamour is, if you admit that you're succumbed to glamour, you make yourself vulnerable. Because you've acknowledged what you want and that you don't have it, and that there's kind of impossibility to the thing that you really want, but you're sort of entertaining that. And it is not ironic. It is serious, and it's not ironic. Now, having said that, there is a kind of what I call wised up glamour, where take the really popular, easy element of it would be like the Old Spice commercials. You get to see the handsome buff guy on the white horse and get to enjoy that fantasy, but it's all a joke. It's over the top. There are other elements, I argue that superhero comics are glamorous, and you have to read the book to get the whole argument. All of it actually, I did something on it, but and superhero comics, because everybody knows it's ridiculous. All the people who read them know that it's ridiculous, that it's a fantasy. They have always had that sort of element of the double vision, and that preserves the escapism while kind of laughing at it, and or acknowledging that there's a sort of, and I think for us in this sort of deeply ironic age, that's maybe a little necessary. But I think it's really about not wanting to be taken advantage of, not in a market transaction, but not wanting to be taken advantage of, even if you never spend 1 red cent, but not wanting to let yourself go into acknowledging that you'd like a different life.
I just wonder though, is this partly why we have such a conflicted relationship with beauty? How we often associate, someone is beautiful, how could they possibly be talented or smart, etc.
Right. Well, we have a conflicted relationship with beauty because we would all really like to be beautiful, but we feel like it's really not substantive. We should take it. We should value other things, so then we tell ourselves that beauty is not real, or it's not valuable, or it's not. When I say it's not real, we say everybody is equally beautiful. Well, everybody is not equally beautiful. And beauty is not on the inside. Being a good person is on the inside, but that is different from beauty. We should be able to say, you can be beautiful and be a good person. You can be beautiful and be a bad person. These are different things. It's just like intelligence or athletic ability or, any other desirable trait. But we do have, it really does make us crazy. And it is an interesting question of why beauty makes us crazy, and why there's a whole industry devoted to saying how it makes us crazy. When athletic ability doesn't make us crazy, intelligence doesn't make us crazy. In the same way, which is not to say, there is a stigma around talking about too much intellectual distinctions, but now we've gotten ourselves in these where people are segregating themselves more and more by IQ, so that doesn't come up as much. Maybe eventually people will segregate, the beautiful people will be all together, and the rest of us will be, out.
We're in. These beautiful people next door. Okay, yes. Well, we'd like to invite everyone next door to continue the conversation and to have a glass of wine and some snacks. And please join me in thanking Virginia Postrel.